In my last video, I talked about how segregation and biased empathy combine to create inequality, how two natural tendencies we all have are sufficient to generate the whole problem of inequality of opportunities. Segregation makes us feel closer to some people, and biased empathy makes us more likely to help the people we feel close to. So, our acts of kindness and support stay mostly within certain circles. Now, if some of those circles happen to start off more powerful, even because of luck, that dynamic just keeps reinforcing itself. And that is how inequality gets built and grows. Not from bad intentions, but from everyday acts of kindness that are not evenly distributed. But here's the thing, the most dangerous consequence of segregation and biased empathy is not even the inequality of opportunities they create. In this video, I will show you how these two forces lead to an epistemic crisis, a systemic failure in how we evaluate, trust, and update what we believe. You see, the issue is that when we face two competing ideas, we do not necessarily keep the better one. And different people end up keeping different ideas, which makes it feel like we cannot trust each other because everyone else just seems unreasonable. Sounds familiar, right? But what if I told you that this is just the beginning of the problem? There's a whole chain of dynamics that show up after that. Quiet little forces shaping how we think, almost invisibly. And it's those invisible forces that help explain why this crisis runs so deep and why it is so hard to fix. Okay, so let's start by quickly revisiting one of the key forces behind this epistemic crisis, segregation. I did a whole video about this because I think the more superficial version of segregation, the one most people think about, completely misses the point of how consequential this idea really is. Segregation isn't just about where we live, it is also about how we separate ourselves into different social networks based on the choices we make every day. We surround ourselves with people who share our interests, our lifestyles, our beliefs. Without even realizing it, we end up mostly interacting with people who think like us, who speak like us, who reinforce what we already believe. This is the foundation of the problem, because who we interact with affects not just what we hear, but what we trust. And that brings us back to the second major force, biased empathy. It is about the fact we don't typically have the empathy to ask ourselves, wait, if I belong to another community, would this idea still seem right to me? And what about this other idea? Would it still seem wrong to me? Because we don't practice this mental exercise, we gradually become convinced our filter view is just neutral, balanced, objective, when it is not. I like to call this manifestation of biased empathy, when it shows up in the realm of ideas, biased trust. It is just our tendency to trust ideas that feel familiar or comfortable and to doubt ideas that seem unfamiliar or strange. Now, when I say familiar or comfortable, I don't just mean the content of the idea itself. It could also be about how the message is delivered or who you are hearing it from. For example, imagine someone says a sentence in a British accent. It might sound more sophisticated or credible, not because the content is better, but because many of us associate that accent with intelligence and education. Now, imagine the same sentence is spoken in an accent that people, consciously or unconsciously, associate with being less educated. The same words can suddenly sound less convincing, not because of the message, but because the speaker doesn't fit our mental image of someone smart. Sometimes this happens without us even noticing. We just feel like something is off, or that the message isn't as trustworthy, even though we can't quite explain why. And this bias isn't just about accents. It can show up in tone, gesture, posture, or emotional expression. Maybe the speaker's demeanor feels too intense. Maybe their body language makes them seem closed off or too passionate. Even the pace or rhythm of someone's speech can influence how trustworthy they seem. Sometimes people don't feel smooth to us, not because of their logic, but because of something in their delivery that doesn't match what we are used to. And when that happens, we're more likely to doubt what they are saying, even if we don't realize we are doing it. Because we mostly communicate with people who share our views, most of the ideas we encounter naturally align with our existing beliefs. And again, that is not just about what is being said, it is also about how it is being said. Maybe the speaker's gestures feel familiar, maybe their tone of voice isn't abrasive, maybe their emotional energy feels calibrated to what we are used to. All of that builds a sense of comfort, And comfort, in turn, builds trust, often before we have even evaluated the idea. Meanwhile, ideas from outside our networks, ideas that challenge our beliefs, instantly feel strange. The speaker or the idea, or even the way the idea is expressed, doesn't feel right. So we tune out, or push back, or put them under heavy scrutiny. This is how biased trust works. It is not just about liking or disliking a claim. It is about thousands of subtle cues that shape whether an idea even gets a fair hearing. Now, let's look carefully at how we consume information, what I would like to call the demand side of the epistemic crisis. If you think about it, the ideal intellectually honest person would spend just as much energy questioning ideas they like as ideas they dislike. For instance, imagine you strongly support vaccination. You come across a study claiming vaccines are highly effective and have minimal side effects. Ideally, you would examine that study just as carefully as you would a study claiming vaccines cause severe health problems. But in practice, we scrutinize ideas that feel wrong far more intensely than ideas that feel right. Not just a little more, but dramatically more. And that is understandable. We all have limited attention. It simply doesn't make sense to spend equal effort evaluating every piece of information we encounter. So, we instinctively save our critical thinking budget for ideas, or better yet, idea packages that feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Because that's the truth. We don't just judge ideas, we judge the whole package, right? The content, the speaker, the tone, the delivery. And why do some idea packages feel uncomfortable? That is exactly where the combination of segregation and biased trust come into play. Because of biased trust, we developed strong filters, only giving a fair shot to ideas that come in the right package. When a challenging idea package appears, either because the content or the speaker or the tone or the delivery feels unfamiliar, we instantly doubt it. We raise the bar for evidence. We question the motive. We pick it apart. Meanwhile, idea packages that feel familiar, we let them in. We nod along. We move on. And just like that, we have created an asymmetry. But on top of that, because of segregation, we ended up with two separate problems. First, we are hearing different information because we consume different media, we talk to different people. But second, and this is something people often miss, even when we hear the same thing, we're using different filters to decide what makes sense and what does not. And if that is not enough, here's the deeper problem. The difference isn't just how much we scrutinize each idea, it is also what we do after that, what actually gets folded into our understanding and what gets discarded. For instance, imagine you are worried about your kids and screen time. Then you come across a study that says too much screen time can reduce attention spans and delay sleep. That makes sense to you. It fits what you already suspect. You nod and move on. It feels like a little internal high five, almost like a brownie point. Now flip it. You read a different study, one that says screen time can help kids learn or stay connected. Also true information. But here's where it gets interesting. Just to simplify the point, to make sure we all understand this is a new point, it is not something I already said, let's assume you don't scrutinize the study at all. You fully trust the source. Maybe it's from a reputable institution you respect. Even then, if you're really mindful, if you pay close attention to your reaction in that moment, you might still notice something immediate, a little voice going, yeah, but. You start to push back, not because the study was flawed, but because it goes against what you already feel is true. What we feel is true isn't about the one fact, it's about the bigger story we already believe, like whether screen time in general is good or bad. That is a more general judgment. It is not only about one specific dimension of good or bad. And when that happens, the information doesn't really land to you. Your brain starts arguing before you even finish listening. And often, that pushback takes the form of what sounds like whataboutism. You don't say, that's false. You say, yeah, but what about the studies that show sleep problems and attention issues? It sounds reasonable. It even is reasonable. But it's also a subtle way of dodging the weight of the new evidence. Even if you remember the study later, you probably won't give it much weight. It ends up filed under arguments people make, not in your own internal sense of the pros and cons of screen time. It doesn't shift your balance of evidence, not because it lacked credibility, but because it never had a fair shot at changing your mind. But even that is not the end of it. There is yet one more layer. Sometimes we fully accept a piece of information, but we quietly move it to the background. Not because it's false, but because it feels inconvenient or hard to reconcile with what we already believe or care about. It is a kind of cognitive dissonance. The brain says, sure, that might be true, but it's not the main issue. So, despite our best intentions, we are not as objective or intellectually honest as we would like to think. But we often believe we are, and that belief itself becomes one additional layer of distortion. When we hear something that doesn't sit right, we don't just feel discomfort, we feel justified in dismissing it. Our inner voice says, it is not just unfamiliar, it's flawed. I'm seeing it clearly, they are not. This mistaken belief in our own objectivity plays a central role in generating mistrust and eventually contempt. When people from another network present conflicting information, we don't just disagree, we question their sincerity, intelligence, or motivations. We wonder, how could they possibly believe something so obviously wrong? Or more likely, why are they downplaying this important point? This makes genuine dialogue really difficult. We lose the capacity to engage honestly and constructively because each side feels like they are objectively right, while the other side must be either ignorant or dishonest. As you can see, there are a lot of layers of distortion, and so far we're only talking about the demand side of information. Just to recap, first, we hear different things. Second, even if we heard the same thing, you and I would filter it differently. Third, even if we heard it and filtered it the same way, you and I would still retain different things in our minds. Fourth, even if we hear the same thing, filter it the same way, and retain the same thing in our brains, you and I might still assign it different levels of importance. And fifth, even after all that, we still think we're being objective. So when we compare our views with other people's, we assume they're the ones being unreasonable or dishonest. Now, let's turn to the other side of this epistemic crisis, how information is produced and shared, the supply side. The most obvious issue here is outright falsehood, like fake news. Fake news spreads so effectively exactly because it exploits all these layers of distortions on the demand side I just talked about. When information matches our existing beliefs perfectly, we lower our guard. We rarely pause to think critically or check the source because biased trust reassures us that this information makes sense. We become easy targets for misinformation specifically tailored to our worldview. But even more common and certainly more dangerous than fake news is what I would like to call unrepresentative true news. Let me explain what I mean. Think of two news channels covering immigration. One mostly shows stories of undocumented immigrants committing crimes. The other mostly shows immigrants working hard, contributing to the economy, and raising families. Both are telling true stories. But by only showing one kind of story, they create entirely different emotional reactions and different political conclusions about the same issue. Or think about crime reporting. In some cities, local news might lead every night with stories of violent crime, robberies, shootings, arrests. All of it is true, but it gives the impression that crime is spiraling out of control, even if crime rates are historically low. The result is real fear even when the numbers tell a different story. Or think about the stories we heard during the COVID pandemic. Some people mostly heard about the downsides of school closures, kids falling behind academically, struggling with loneliness and mental health issues. Others mostly heard about the benefits of school closure, how closing schools helped protect vulnerable families and reduce the spread of the virus. Both stories were true, but which version you encounter depend on your networks and what those networks were already primed to believe. And again, we rarely stop to think, what am I not seeing? What stories were just as true but didn't make it into my feed? So far, I've talked about information coming from external sources, but the problem gets even trickier when we realize that we ourselves are also supplying information, both online and offline. Because we mostly talk within our own segregated networks, our ideas rarely face any real pushback. We get used to easy agreement, and because of that, we don't develop the habit of adding nuance, caveats, or uncertainty to what we say. Just like a muscle we never exercise, our capacity for epistemic humility gets weaker. And when we start evaluating ideas before we speak, we rarely ask ourselves, what might I be missing? Remember, we think we're being objective, right? So we just feel very confident about what we're about to say. When we think, Climate change is the most important problem humans face right now. How can people not see that? We don't usually also think, of course, I have the luxury of thinking long term. If I were struggling just to afford medicine for my kids, maybe climate change wouldn't feel like the most urgent thing. When we think, these people just want everything handed to them, we rarely stop to consider also, maybe I would think differently if I had grown up in a place with broken schools, constant stress, and no clear path forward. Maybe what looks like not trying is actually someone surviving the best way they know how. And this is not only about politically charged ideas. The same thing happens with everyday things. When we think, parents today are too soft, they don't set clear limits, we rarely stop to think also, but maybe if I had a child with special needs or had gone through trauma myself, I would approach parenting very differently. When we think, that person just needs to be more confident, success is all about putting yourself out there, we rarely stop to also think, but if I had grown up constantly being interrupted, ignored, or mocked, maybe speaking up wouldn't feel so simple. These caveats are important. They recognize the complexity and subjectivity of the issue. They show that we recognize different life experiences and that we are aware our own view might not be the only valid one. But because our networks rarely challenge us, we seldom use these caveats. Again, this comes directly from our biased empathy. We almost never step back to imagine, if I were explaining this idea to someone from a completely different background, what counterpoints or questions would they immediately raise? Without practicing this kind of empathetic imagination, our messages become overly simplified and overly confident. Now, the big problem is that these two sides, the demand side and the supply side, don't just exist in parallel. They reinforce each other in a feedback loop. On the demand side, because we mostly consume information from within our own network, we become used to ideas that already fit our worldview. And because we're familiar with them, we don't scrutinize them much. They feel like common sense. Then the supply side kicks in. Because we mostly share ideas within that same network, where those ideas are already accepted, we feel confident that they are objective, and we don't feel the need to add caveats, nuance, or acknowledge opposing views. And our ideas pass through easily, so we stop practicing the skill of anticipating disagreement or adjusting our message to a different audience. And then we consume those oversimplified, overly confident takes from others in our own network. And when we share again and no one pushes back, we become even more confident, even more absolute. And over time, we hear them echoed back to us with even fewer caveats. So our own sense of certainty increases. So each round of communication takes away a little bit more complexity, a little more nuance, and makes us a bit more confident in our own perspective. No one in this reinforcing feedback loop is trying to be dishonest. No one is deliberately spreading falsehoods. In fact, there may be no falsehood at all. Every piece of information we encounter could be technically true. The problem is that it's not representative. It is a narrow slice of reality, shaped by the networks we belong to. Because segregation and biased trust influence both what we learn and what we say, we ended up trapped inside echo chambers. But these echo chambers are getting less nuanced over time. So they are becoming more distant from each other. I think most of us know at some level that we are in an echo chamber, but we severely underestimate just how far apart these echo chambers really are. And there are a few reasons why we miss that. First, this feedback loop creates a compounding effect that we are just not wired to see. Our brains struggle to grasp compounding change. It feels like a small separation at first, just a few differences in perspective. But those small gaps compound. And suddenly, we're living in an information world so far apart, it feels like we're not even talking about the same reality. And in a way, we're not. I talked a lot about the role of feedback loop in making us underestimate things in my previous videos. But here, we have one more reason to underestimate this separation. What actually spreads inside a network isn't just an idea, it is an idea package, a combination of several things like content, tone, delivery, emotional energy, and framing. So there are many more dimensions for these echo chambers to be different from each other. Earlier, I mentioned that people strip away nuance when they speak within their network, because they don't get any pushback. But nuance is just one dimension of the idea package. People are adjusting all the other parts too. If a previous framing of an idea received no pushback in your network, next time you keep using the same framing. If last time you got pushback on something you said, next time you don't say it, or you change your tone when saying it. And that's how these idea packages get delineated over time, through a dynamic process of error correction. But these delineations are completely different across networks. So by the time you hear an idea package from outside your own network, it is likely you will hear something completely different from what you're used to. There's going to be a greater chance that package will feel off, like it just doesn't sit right. That is why this epistemic crisis is so difficult to escape. It is not just a problem of bad information or bad actors. It is a structural problem. Even without fake news and even without bad actors, we'll still face the same problem. It is not just about what we consume from outside sources. It is also about the content that we create and share ourselves. Within each bubble, it's almost like we have made an unspoken mediocrity pact. We lower the bar for each other, not because we are lazy or dishonest, but because our idea sounds right to the people around us. They pass through easily, so the caveats feel irrelevant, and we don't push for nuance. Over time, we stop practicing the kind of thinking that can hold up outside our bubble. And yes, when we speak to an outsider about our view, they might be right to think that our view is one-sided and simplistic. But they rarely notice that their own view is just as limited. So they assume we're just uninformed, or worse, that we're intellectually dishonest, and they feel justified in writing us off. And as if that wasn't bad enough, there is one more layer to this problem, one that is critical to understand before we can even start thinking about solutions. Not all echo chambers have the same power. Some networks have louder voices, more institutional backing, more media visibility, more influence over what gets published, what gets funded, what gets taught. And that's where a new kind of distortion enters. Because here's the thing, if the error correction mostly targets ideas from less powerful networks, while ideas from dominant networks slip through with less scrutiny, then we don't just have an epistemic crisis, we have a biased epistemic crisis. Now, someone might say, sure, but maybe those powerful networks are more likely to be right. After all, people in these powerful networks tend to be more educated. Honestly, I do not know how to even evaluate that in an objective way, but maybe that's true. But there's another side to consider. The more powerful the echo chamber is, the less incentive its members have to search for nuance. Why bother, right? Their ideas are less challenged. So even if those networks could have better instincts about the truth in the first place, over time they're also the least likely to keep questioning themselves. So that might lead them farther from the truth. Now, of course, this is a simplified picture. The real world is much more complex. Networks often overlap, and also criticism sometimes happen within the bubble. But still, these structural forces are real, and they tilt the whole system. They shape which ideas get a seat at the table, and which ones never make it past the door. And that brings us to one of the most powerful networks of all. The network that decides what counts as legitimate knowledge, what gets published, what gets taught, what gets trusted. I'm talking about the world of traditional experts, universities, research institutions, and the academic community more generally. These groups have had a dominant role in shaping the flow of information for a long time. They have had the platform, the reach, and the credibility. And their influence extends far beyond the academic world itself. It affects the perspective of the people who go on to shape public life: journalists, policymakers, judges, doctors, lawyers, business leaders. Most of them spend years in classrooms taught by professors like me. And in those classrooms, they learn how to argue, which questions are worth asking, what counts as evidence, and what kind of tone sounds credible. So academia doesn't just filter ideas within its own walls, it shapes which kinds of idea packages are seen as most credible out there. It helps set the tone for the entire conversation across schools, media, law, government, business, and public life. And because of that, it has been instrumental in deciding which idea packages survive and which ones quietly disappear. But truth and knowledge go much deeper than what academia tends to focus on. Until we rethink the foundations of how knowledge is produced, we won't even notice the bias that shape what gets published, what gets taught, what gets trusted. There's something deeper underneath all of this, something about how we decide what counts as real, something about the standards we use to judge what is valid, what is rigorous, what's worth taking seriously. In the next video, I want to start zooming in on that. And this is where I think we can start finding a way out of this mess.